Good morning, folks. My name is Steve Herzenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Keystone Research Center. It's great to have you here at the, I think, something like 15th Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center Budget Summit. I appreciate people coming in a little late because that gave me a more extended opportunity. Yeah, this is also the first in-person budget summit since 2019 and the first ever hybrid one. So hello also to folks across the state and on Zoom and in the PCN audience. We miss you in this room, and in person is better in terms of building relationships and coalitions. So next time Keystone Research Center or Pennsylvania's State Tax and Budget Project do a big event with an in-person option, make a point to be there in the flesh. I'm pleased to be here wearing my one remaining suit. My other suit was taken out of my car last week, somewhere between our garage in Harrisburg and the parking lot of a hotel in Pittsburgh, leading Jeff Garris to ask, why would anyone steal your suit? I thought that was a fair question, and one to which I have no answer. We have a great day for you, and not simply because I'll be co-presenting the PowerPoint based on the PBPC budget analysis instead of next year. We have 7 terrific workshops with great presenters such as Claudia DePalmer, one of the lawyers in the successful school funding case challenging Pennsylvania's failure to provide a constitutionally adequate system of public education. Ariel Klagsbrun, the campaign director for Acre Tax the Rich in Philadelphia. John Doherty, Special Assistant to the National Painters Union and a key champion for federal climate infrastructure legislation with strong labor standards that will deliver community benefits. Rob Baer, the dynamic new president of the Pennsylvania Building and Construction Trades Council. Kate Shaw, Pennsylvania's Deputy Secretary for Higher Education. Jess Shirley, the newly promoted second in command at the Department of Environmental Protection. And Ian Gavigan, one of the founding organizers of an exciting umbrella labor organization in higher education Labor United. Plus, of course, our own stunning team of organizers and researchers talking about fair taxation, the minimum wage, and other vital topics. I'll do a fuller set of thank yous to our team, about our staff team later in the day, but I will start by thanking Jeff Garris, our lead organizer for this day, who is highly skilled at corralling the team to pull off this event, including managing as well as insulting the boss. At the end of the day, we've offered Jeff the 2:45 to 3 p.m. slot for the inaugural stand-up routine he's been threatening. He has the day to figure out if he wants to take us up on that. With that, I'm going to present the first part of a PowerPoint for which my colleague Diana Olson deserves all the credit. I will hand things over to her in a few minutes, but I'm going to present the first part of the PowerPoint, which is a summary of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center budget analysis that's released today, and some hard copies of which are outside for those of you who are old-fashioned and don't want to just read it online or get the PDF. So with that, I'm going to dive into the substance of this presentation, and let's make sure this works. It does. Okay. Our big picture forest level perspective on this proposed budget from Governor Shapiro is that it has many of the right priorities, like education, mental health, support for property owners and renters, the need for higher minimum wage, increasing funding for apprenticeship, and other items that we'll highlight as we go through this presentation. But the second forest level observation is that Governor Shapiro, in some areas, has left it to the legislature to invest the level of resources the state now needs, especially in education. Fortunately, we have a new legislative lineup in Harrisburg, including a switch in the majority in the Pennsylvania House. So I think the prospects for the legislature to use the governor's proposal as the starting point, but then to do better than that, are much better than they would have been for the last 8 years. Okay, The next few slides are kind of basic orienting slides to the Pennsylvania's budget. This pie chart sort of shows that actually the general fund money that comes from a range of different sources of revenue, primarily taxes, is actually only a little more than a third of the total operating budget, 38%. There's a lot of federal funds. The last few years, because of pandemic relief, that piece has been larger. The next few years, as we'll hear about later, it will also be larger because of some of the money from the bipartisan infrastructure law in particular. And then there are a whole range of other funds in Pennsylvania, the motor license fund, the lottery fund. Okay. So this is an important slide because, again, you hear a lot of rhetoric consistently about big government and the claim that government voraciously expands its share of the economic pie and raises taxes. And but those of us who still live in a fact-based world know that that's not right. And this chart shows that. It shows the revenues and expenditures for the last roughly 25 years relative to the size of the economic pie called gross state product. And it shows that the trend is not upwards. We're not spending ever more. Actually, the Pennsylvania general fund expenditures and revenues have been trending down. So they were for the first dozen or so years until right before the Great Recession, or running along at between 4.7 and 5%, depending on whether you're talking about expenditures or revenues. And then there's been a dip in both lines of order of magnitude, 0.6 or half a percentage point. And that has continued through. There was a bit of an increase again in the general fund expenditure revenues, particularly revenues, as a share of GSP in the pandemic, but that's over now. And so government is a pretty small, general revenues are a pretty small fraction of only about 4% of the economic pie in Pennsylvania. And again, in certain ways, too small, because it means we're not investing in the things that we need to. This is a pretty weedy and hard to read slide. So we'll make the PowerPoint available to folks after today's event. But the basic point of this slide is that, again, when you're thinking about the need to make more investments and for the legislature to build on Governor Shapiro's proposal in some areas, the good news is we have the resources to invest more money. There's the state surplus is now going to be projected to be an accumulated nearly $9 billion, 8.66, by the end of June this year. And again, some increases in that from expectations a year ago include actually the federal government extending some of its generosity, for example, in terms of the share of medicated funds beyond the anticipated cutoff of that increase in pandemic-related increase in generosity a year ago. And then if you add the rainy day fund, actually, I'm going to say one more thing. In terms of the surplus, it's also true that the revenues are now more than $1 billion above expectations earlier. And again, some of that has to do with the fact that the economy, the U.S. economy and the Pennsylvania economy are doing quite well. I mean, didn't mean to go over there. Again, we just went through a traumatic obviously, in the first part of 2020 period, when we had to shut down big parts of the economy so folks could social distance and we could try to rein in the spread of the pandemic. And so we had an unprecedented dip in terms of the economy. And if we had recovered from that at the slow pace, for example, that we recovered from the Great Recession, because Congress after the 2009 elections was committed to an austerity policy and deprived President Obama of the resources necessary to grow quickly back to full employment. So it took us 5, 6, 7 years after 2009-10 to get back to something close to full employment. But the policies we've had in Washington, first under President Trump, the first two rescue plans passed when he was president, then under President Biden with the American Rescue Plan, have at this point, they're looking pretty good because they got us back to full employment pretty quickly. They got us back to a point where revenues are growing more than expected, and some of the social expenditures that tend to be associated with high unemployment are lower than anticipated. So, and the other part of the good news is inflation is now down to 5%. Some of us sort of knew that the inflation that we had in the pandemic was very likely, okay, maybe it wasn't as temporary as some folks originally thought it would be, but it was driven much by supply chain issues, by profiteering, by corporations, a lot of it. But unlike the 1970s, when we had things like cost of living adjustments built into union contracts, and we also had a less competitive, globally competitive manufacturing sector. So companies basically had more room to raise their prices without fear of losing market share. Competition among the big American oligopolies in key consumer industries was not that savage. And so in that decade, when you got oil price shocks or increasing prices in agricultural markets, you then had mechanisms that propagated that inflation and built it into the economy. We didn't have, those mechanisms don't exist. For better or mostly worse, unions now represent a much more smaller part of the workforce, and the contracts that do exist don't have automatic cost of living adjustments, etc. So it's not a surprise that inflation's down to 5%. And if you look at Federal Reserve projections, they're still, they expect it to be down in the neighborhood of 3% within the next 12 months. Okay, but here's the one thing that troubles us in terms of the governor's budget. So on the one hand, we have this big surplus, which could be used for some of our big needs. But what you see is over the next 5 years, this is the last of the American Rescue Plan resources this year, for example. And I think we can expect the federal generosity around Medicaid to return to pre-pandemic levels. So what we're now looking at is a structural deficit in which in future years, our needs are our expenses are gonna grow, and our revenues are not gonna grow in tandem with that. And we're gonna get, we're projected to get a series of deficits that if you add them up over 5 years, are on the order of the current surplus from the rainy day fund plus the surplus. So from our perspective, that's worrisome, because if policymakers chose that option, that would mean they were saying, despite the court case around education funding, despite the absolute disaster that is Pennsylvania funding for higher education, we're not going to address the needs for investments in our common future, and we're just going to save that money so that we can cover these deficits and not raise any revenues. We think that would be a disastrous choice for Pennsylvania's future. Okay. Yeah, okay. So again, we've walked through this. slide. Yeah, bottom line is the last point there. We need recurring and reliable revenue, which would actually allow us, we can use the current surplus to invest in the future, and then we need reliable and recurring revenue from people and corporations with the ability to pay to sustain that into the future. And I think this is where I turn it over to Diana. No, not yet. Okay, I'll keep going. So this is revenue. Okay, so this pie chart shows you where we get revenue from, and 40% of it roughly comes from personal income tax, another third from the sales and use tax. The corporate income tax piece is small. And then we see that we're going to see a couple dimensions of the unfairness of the Pennsylvania tax system. This is for individuals or families, taxpayers. On the bar, the tallest bar closest to me is the bottom 20% of taxpayers. The smallest bar on the right is the top 1%, richest 1% of taxpayers. It's 6%. So if you look at just those two bars, but it holds for the whole graph. What we refer to this Pennsylvania tax system as upside down, because in the end, you want those with the greatest ability to pay on your right, as you look at the screen, to be higher. But we have this reverse situation where those folks are paying less than half as much as the bottom fifth, and only 60% as much as folks in actually no close to only a bit more than half as much as the middle fifth. And then the other part of the unfairness is the fact that corporations don't pay their share. That's a long-standing trend. Corporations now contribute half what they did in 1972 to the general fund. And that got worse with the cuts in the corporate net income tax passed last year, and which weren't combined with closing corporate loopholes. So those, again, dimensions of the Pennsylvania tax system we need to fix. And then the last section I'm going through is there aren't a lot of big changes in terms of revenue and taxes in the budget, but here's a couple. There's a tax credit proposed for some of these shortage occupations where we can't find enough teachers. We need nurses, we need police officers. So there's a tax credit for those folks. In the case of teachers, it's new teachers can get a tax credit for 3 years, and also actually teachers from out of state can get a tax credit for 3 years if they have certification that enables them to teach in Pennsylvania. So that tax credit would cost $23.7 million, which is not a lot and does seem like a worthwhile investment. And then one other important change from an equity point of view is the expansion of the existing property tax and rent rebate program for seniors in Pennsylvania. The short story is Pennsylvania's income eligibility for that rent, those property tax rebates hasn't changed in a long time. So that inflation, particularly recently, keeps on pushing more and more families above the threshold for eligibility to that critical property tax relief that struggling seniors need, they're not getting. So Governor Shapiro has made a proposal to change that and actually made more generous and put on a par the relief that's available for renters. So that's a very positive proposal from our perspective. And then one thing to look out for that won't help with the general fund this year is the proposal of taxing adult use marijuana, assuming it's legalized, a proposed 20% tax, and that would get about $60 million more each year, 60, 120, 190 over the next 3 years if that's enacted. I'm doing this too, right? Yeah. Okay, sorry. You can see who's in charge here. So raising the minimum wage. Governor Shapiro has proposed a $15 an hour minimum wage effective January 1st of next year. Many of you may know that 3 of the states around us are on a path to 15, and for some parts of New York, they've already reached 15, and there are vigorous debates in New York now about going into the low 20s with their minimum wage. New Jersey's on a path to 15. Maryland's on a path to 15. We're at 725. Even West Virginia and Ohio are higher than Pennsylvania. So this chart is just an embarrassment for anyone who lives in Pennsylvania. And you also see this at the low end of the Pennsylvania wage distribution. You see that the gains for folks at the 10th percentile and the 20th percentile, there've been some gains because the labor market's tighter, and because in border regions, you've got competition for workers. So that the increases in the minimum wage in other states drives to some extent increases in Pennsylvania. But they're much more paltry increases than you see in the other states. So thousands of dollars, low wage workers getting thousands of dollars less. We did some modeling of the governor's proposal. There are no details beyond the proposed level, but we did some modeling that assumes that workers that are subject to the lower tipped minimum wage also get $15 an hour. And so if you run those numbers through, you find that actually over 1.5 million. There's here, right? Yeah, there's over 1.5 million workers would see an increase in their wages, and the average is over 4,000 per worker. You know, and that increase will create more economy boosting jobs because people, when they have money in their pocket, people who receive at or near the low end of the labor market, the minimum wage, mostly spend their stuff, much of it on local businesses or at local businesses. Yeah, it's 1.57 million workers. And again, the demographic distribution of those is kind of well known from previous number crunching, but it's disproportionately women and people of color, and it's not teens. So with that, I'll take it over to Diana. Okay.
One real quick question.
Yeah.
On the slide that you had that showed the disparity between the rich and the poor. So if we have the uniformity clause, how are you calculating that?
So again, so the uniformity clause applies to the income tax. That chart was all state and local taxes. So that's part of it. And that's the core explanation. So yeah.
Thank you.
All right, look at all of us in person. It's exciting. It's been a while. All right, so I'm going to walk you through some of the governor's key proposals in education, human services, and a couple of other areas. First of all, let's look at the governor's basic spending proposal. The governor this year is proposing a $44.4 billion budget. From last year, this would be an increase of 8%. So this pie chart breaks down where the money is proposed to be spent, which tends to look very similar from year to year. The majority of general fund monies are spent on pre-K through 12 education, 36%, and on human services, which includes medical assistance, long-term living, and human services, other human services, for a total of 43%. The next largest department is the Department of Corrections, which is 7% of the general fund. So now I'm going to talk through education. So as the previous pie chart showed, funding for education is a large part of the state's general fund. Governor Shapiro is proposing a 5.7% increase in pre-K to grade 12 education spending for a total nearly $16 billion budget. Now, the last figure showed all of pre-K to 12 education funding, but we also like to look specifically at what we call classroom funding, or the funding that will go directly to classrooms, excluding things like pensions and transportation. So this figure shows the change in funding from year to year in classroom funding. So you can see here in orange, the large decrease in funding during Governor Corbett's education cuts in 2011-12. Governor Shapiro's funding for classrooms, as you can see, is higher than it's been over much of the last decade, but just over half of what was invested last year. Many of you have probably heard about the landmark education funding case that was decided in favor of the plaintiffs just a couple months ago, which really has changed the landscape and the possibilities of education funding in Pennsylvania. The Commonwealth Court Judge Jubilier ruled that the state has failed to provide a constitutional, thorough, and efficient system of public education. The court order found that the school's funding system violates the education clause of the Pennsylvania Constitution because it fails to ensure that, quote, every student receives a meaningful opportunity to succeed academically, socially, and civically, which requires that all students which have access to a comprehensive, effective, and contemporary system of public education. The judge found that all Pennsylvania students don't have access to such a system, and students who live in school districts with low incomes and low property values are deprived of the same opportunities and are therefore deprived of equal protection under the law. The court calls on the, quote, legislature, executive branch, and educators to make the constitutional promise a reality in the Commonwealth. So as many of you know, in 2015, the legislature, knowing Pennsylvania funding distribution was unfair, did enact a new method of distributing state aid to school districts called the Fair Funding Formula. So this formula takes into account each district's distinct needs, like the number of students, those living in poverty, English language learners. But not all funding goes through the formula, only new money allocated to education since 2015. So you can see in this figure, the light blue part of the bars is the amount of school funding being distributed in a fair way each year. So this year you can see a larger share would go through the formula than in previous years, but it is still only about 25% of basic education funds. But unlike the last 2 years, Governor Shapiro does not include new Level Up funding this year. Level Up funding was established 2 years ago to combat historic school funding inequities. The Level Up concept is simple. It targets a portion of new state education funding to the districts with the greatest need, providing funding to the 100 most underfunded Pennsylvania school districts. In the first year, there was $100 million through Level Up. This year, it's $225 million, and the proposal for next year is $0. We know that Level Up is not a comprehensive solution to the school funding problem, and we need to come up with one. But in the meantime, Level Up is the only mechanism we have to deal with the worst inequities. Education advocates, including ourselves, are advocating for new Level Up funding this year of $300 million. The legislature could and should act to get this into the budget this year. So this figure shows one of the problems identified in the school funding lawsuit pretty clearly. Here we divide Pennsylvania's 500 school districts into 4 groups by the share of students living in poverty. So the bar on the left is the first quartile and includes school districts with the highest share of students in poverty. Here we measure for each quartile the per student state funding gap that exists to adequately fund our schools, which is often referred to as the adequacy gap. As you can see, high poverty school districts have the largest funding gap, over $3,500 per student. The funding gap decreases as the share of students in poverty decreases. It is important to note, however, that on average, even low poverty school districts in the Commonwealth have a funding gap of over $800 per student. So this figure is the same as above, specifically the red bars show the adequacy gap as it currently stands. We also added in the blue bars, which is would be the adequacy gap of Governor Shapiro's proposal, which is $567 million in new basic education funding run through. So as you can see, his proposal would reduce the adequacy gap. But one other thing we put on there is the gray bars, which shows the proposal recommended by education advocates, which is to increase BEF funding to $700 million and add new Level Up funding this year of $300 million. So given the court ruling this year, more funding through basic education funding and Level Up will get us closer to an adequate and fair funding system and would signal real progress towards the court-ordered mandate. So this figure shows the same information, but organized by the share of Black students by quartile, and we see similar trends here. So this figure is about special education. As many of you know, school districts are mandated by state and federal law to cover the cost of special education for students who need it. The need for special education services has grown, but state funding has not kept up, putting enormous strain on local school districts to cover the costs. In 2008, Pennsylvania paid 32% of school district special ed costs, but by 2019-20, the state share had dropped to just 22%. So this has put, enormous strain on local school districts. This year, the governor proposes nearly an 8% increase in special ed funding. As this figure shows, it's a significant and much needed increase, but it isn't enough to address the need. Let me see how we're doing on time here. Okay. So yeah, there's a couple other K through 12 education proposals that the governor has made. For career and technical education, he proposes 12 million that would directly support CTE through upgrading technology and equipment. It would provide support for expanding program in high demand areas. And it would also increase funding to increase computer science and STEM programs statewide. And there's also 8.5 million he proposes to strengthen CTE connections to industry. Actually, I have a couple more things. Steve had talked about the tax credits for new teachers. One thing that Shapiro has talked a lot about is mental health funding for students and staff. The governor proposes a new program, $100 million to fund the school-based mental health supports block grant, which would aim to boost mental health support and build a pipeline of school-based mental health workers. Each school district would receive $100,000 as a base grant and then additional funding based on the number of students they have. This funding is flexible, so students can decide how to use their funds. It can be used for hiring mental health staff, contracting services out to nonprofits, or providing telehealth. Another thing Governor Shapiro proposes is a universal free school breakfast program for schools to continue the pandemic era policy that made school breakfast free to all students in public schools. And lastly, the governor proposes $100 million or $500 million over 5 years to address environmental hazards in our schools. This figure is about pre-K funding. Governor Shapiro this year proposes a $33 million increase in pre-K funding, which is an increase of 8.4%. This would go for pre-K counts and Head Start supplemental assistance program. The funding for pre-K counts would increase state reimbursement for providers, helping providers deal with increased costs and increase early childhood education teacher pay. We know that the pandemic really exacerbated a staffing crisis in early childhood education where pay remains low. And a recent study in Pennsylvania found that 85% of providers face a staffing shortage. All right, now I'm going to move on to higher ed. Let me provide some context before we get into the governor's proposal. So Pennsylvania severely underfunds higher education. This figure is hard to see, but it ranks all the states by state per capita investment in higher education. Way down at the bottom, you'll see Pennsylvania, the short orange bar. Pennsylvania ranked 47th in the nation and spends about half per capita on higher ed than the national average. So as this figure shows, low state investment in public higher ed has led to public four-year colleges getting more expensive over time, which is represented by the blue line. Compare that to the change in the median household income in Pennsylvania, which is the black line, and you'll see that the price of college has outpaced incomes in Pennsylvania, which has really been a hardship for families and students. High tuition leads to high levels of student debt as students borrow money to attend college. Pennsylvania 2020 graduates had the third highest debt in the country, leaving school with an average of over $39,000 in debt as they start out on their career paths. So as you can see in this figure, funding for higher ed plummeted with the Corbett budget cuts in 2011-12. Last year, with American Rescue Plan dollars, funding finally surpassed the pre-Corbett budget cut years. But it's important to note this data is not adjusted for inflation. So even though the funding has caught up nominally, funding is actually much lower than the 2010-11 once you adjust for inflation. Governor Shapiro proposes a total higher education budget of $1.97 billion for next year, which is a 3.1% increase. Just to talk briefly about the governor's other higher ed proposals, about the state system. The chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Ed was advocating for more funding this year, a budget of $573 million plus an additional $112 million for student aid. He said during House Appropriations budget hearings that lowering tuition is key to expanding their programs that train students for high priority occupations. The governor, however, proposed a more modest increase for the state system this year of $563 million, which is only a 2% increase. Community colleges would also see a 2% increase, and state-related universities would see over a 7% increase. Okay, moving on to human services, I'm going to walk you through some of the key proposals here. There's a lot in this budget. So I encourage people to take a look at the budget analysis, which has more detail. So the governor proposes a $19 billion budget for human services. This is an increase of 16.5% from the previous year. As you can see, there are more than 3/4 of human services spending goes to medical assistance, long-term living, and intellectual disabilities. Spending on medical assistance is expected to jump 23% from this year. One key factor in this increase is that the federal government during the pandemic had increased federal support via what's called the Federal Medicaid Assistance Percentage, FMAP, by 6.2%. Essentially, this higher percentage paid by the feds lowered the amount the state had to pay for medical assistance. But starting last month, this expanded FMAP will be phasing out, which means the state will need to pay more. The governor proposes a $66.7 million increase to replace federal funding and maintain the child care workspace funding. The governor proposes a 17% increase to support individuals with intellectual disabilities and autism. With this funding, 850 people will be able to move from the wait list to the community living or consolidated waiver program, which help individuals live more independently in their homes and communities. And lastly, on this slide, SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is our nation's most effective tool to combat hunger. The federal government had boosted SNAP benefits in response to the pandemic, but this increase ended in March of this year. The cut in benefits affects over 1 million Pennsylvania households. SNAP participants have experienced a cut in benefits at the same time that food prices have also increased, which has led to more food insecurity, leading to what advocates are calling a hunger cliff. The steepest cliff will be for many older adults who only qualify for the minimum SNAP benefit, and they'll see their benefits dropping from $281 a month to $23 a month. Governor Shapiro proposes increasing the minimum SNAP benefit from $23 a month to $35 a month, which is important to increase, but obviously pales in comparison to the support that folks were getting before. So Governor Shapiro has made investments in mental health support a priority in this executive budget. So we already discussed, the school-based mental health support. The governor also proposed to increase base funding for county mental health by $20 million. The goal is to reach $60 million by 2027-28. This increase is important, but not adequate. Counties provide a variety of mental health services to communities, but state funding has not kept up with growing needs. On top of the 10% cut made by the Corbett budget cuts, county funding has been flat funded for most years since, which has limited the ability of counties to keep pace with increased demands and costs to deliver care. A couple other mental health proposals, relates to investing in the 988 system, which is the federal phone code for suicide prevention and mental health crises. He also proposes funding for mental health support services for farmers, as well as people in the criminal justice system with serious mental illness, to avoid institutionalization. One thing I want to mention is that, one notable thing that's missing in the governor's budget is that there are no increases in the TANF grant amounts. We know that TANF grants are critical to Pennsylvania's lowest income families, but the grant amount has remained unchanged since 1990. There's a proposal for a 3.4 increase in Department of Health. Some of the funding would go to help fully fund county and municipal health departments. Another proposal that the governor makes is that he raised the issue of maternal health in his budget address, highlighting the rates of maternal mortality, that they're rising, and that Black women are 3 times more likely to die due to a pregnancy-related issue than white women. The governor proposes to spend $2.3 million to expand maternal health programming in the state, with the aim of reducing maternal mortality rates in the state. Okay. Couple more slides. So corrections and criminal justice. So I like to show this slide, which kind of compares funding for higher education and corrections. Pennsylvania spends significant funding on incarceration. The Department of Corrections is now the 3rd largest department in the state. This figure shows that state funding for incarceration surpassed funding for higher ed in 2011-12 after the Corbett cuts. And since then, funding for higher ed has remained relatively flat, with some increases in recent years, while funding for corrections has been increasing. There are a couple initiatives the governor proposes related to corrections and criminal justice: body cameras worn by parole officers, connecting parolees to social workers early on in their release. Governor Shapiro proposes a $10 million initiative that would fund indigent defense in the state, so those with few resources can have access to quality representation. Pennsylvania is an outlier here. We're one of only 2 states that offer no state resources for indigent defense. There's also additional funding proposed for adult probation services. Economic development and workforce. There's funding proposals in the budget that would support both workers and businesses. There's funding, a significant amount of funding proposed to expand apprenticeship. And there's a $1.3 million increase for labor law compliance investigators, which will grow the number of investigators by 1/3 in Pennsylvania. In terms of businesses, there's support for businesses to help with costs associated with workforce training. There's $20 million to replace pandemic relief used to help historically disadvantaged communities during the pandemic. All right, this is the final section here. When we talk about funding for Department of Environmental Protection, I like to start with what the Pennsylvania Constitution says about our right to clean air and water. It states, quote, "The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all people." So this figure shows all of the funding for DEP, including federal funds, for both 2022-23 and the upcoming year proposed. As you can see, available funds proposed by Governor Shapiro this year are significantly higher than last year. Federal funds, which are in black, are expected to increase, much of which is coming from the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And this would go to a variety of things, including assistance for small and disadvantaged communities, cleaning up abandoned mine lands and acid mine discharge, and plugging orphaned wells. The large increase you see in the other category, which is in dark blue, is mostly driven by a huge increase in the Clean Air Fund, which would see an increase of over $600 million proposed to be used with Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative RGGI funds. However, Pennsylvania has yet to move forward with their participation in RGGI since a court challenge in July. This funding may not be there for next year if Pennsylvania is not able to join RGGI. The governor also proposes $200 million in general fund budget for DEP, which is a 9% increase from last year. One thing that the governor proposes to do with this increase is to fund 30 new staff hired by DEP to allow for increased efficiency in permitting, dam safety investigations, and improved air quality testing. Funding for additional staff is incredibly important for DEP, which has seen a nearly 30% reduction in staff over the past 19 years, despite increasing responsibilities and environmental challenges. And with that, I think we're done.
Yeah, so just very quickly, and then Jeff will come and tell you more about the workshop. So I'm going to give a better answer to the question about Pennsylvania's tax system. There's three main taxes in Pennsylvania, right? There's the state and local taxes. There's the income tax, there's the sales tax, and the property tax. As your question implied, the income tax is basically flat, except at the low end where there's the poverty exemption. So if you have a chart just on that, it looks flat, like you would expect, but with the first bar lower. But then because the other two main tax system, the main taxes are regressive. So the property tax, right? I mean, people buy bigger houses as they get richer, but there's only so much McMansion you can buy. So the property tax ends up taxing middle and low income folks more. It's a share of income. And the sales tax is the same thing. The sales tax rate is on kind of basic stuff, except for food and clothing. Yeah. So if you look at that separately, that's also kinked much higher at the bottom. And so you combine the three and you get the shape you saw. The only way you get any, and most states have that best of an overall flat state and local tax system, because the only way you get that is with a pretty progressive income tax, which we can't do. Right. And then that counters the property and sales taxes. So, okay. Thank you. Sure. We do have, there's a workshop on the Pennsylvania, the fair share tax. So we think there's a way constitutionally to get to a fair income tax and therefore to begin to make the overall tax system in Pennsylvania less upside down. I want to also quickly go back to the forest level in terms of this budget presentation. Again, critical need to build on the governor's proposals and the two big areas in particular where we need a lot more money are K through 12. And again, the court case is affirmed and Governor Shapiro embraced and understood and agrees with the court case. But in higher ed, and there's a workshop on this coming up, the governor said, what we're doing now is not working. Explicitly. And then he's created kind of a task force of leaders in higher ed to come back to him by the end of the year, and then as a foundation for more money that would be proposed next year. But again, the crisis in higher ed is at the point now that just like you need level up, you need some more money for the schools that are most underfunded while you work out the long-term solution in response to the court case in K through 12. Similarly, in higher ed, while you wait for the plan for a Pennsylvania higher education system that is working to replace the one that's not working, you need some more money at the moment for the community colleges and for the state system of higher education. And with that, Jeff, you want to come up?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Garris. I'm the Federal Campaigns and Program Director here at the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Really want to extend my thanks to my colleagues here talking about the budget proposal. Thank you so much to Steve Herzenberg. Thank you to Diana Paulson. Let's give them a round of applause. We are excited today. We have a number of workshops that are going to be starting here at 10:45. I want to tell you where they are and what they are. Also some instructions for those of you who are watching and participating online. Our workshop sessions will start at 10:45. They will conclude at 12 noon. The workshops that are going on right now in the morning after this session, you'll go out the doors here, down the hallway to the end, and then there are signs listing which of the rooms are assigned to which workshops. But to tell you really quickly what we have, the workshop that is going on in the back corner room, that is room D, Pennsylvania room D, is Victory for Children, Pennsylvania's school funding system declared unconstitutional, what the Commonwealth Court ruling means for students and our public schools. We're really pleased to have participating in that workshop one of the attorneys from this successful lawsuit, Claudia DePalma, who is an attorney with the Pennsylvania Interest Law Center, Public Interest Law Center. And we're really looking forward to that. For those of you who are participating virtually, that is a session that we will begin streaming at 10:45. We're only able to stream one of the workshops. For those of you who are participating virtually, that is the workshop that we will be presenting. The other workshops for folks who are here in the room, Imagining a Pennsylvania with Skills Development and Career Supports for All, looking at workforce development and training issues. That is in Pennsylvania room C, down the hallway this way. There's also a workshop, The Incomes and Outcomes of Low-Wage Work, the Minimum Wage and Beyond. That is going on in Pennsylvania room B, down the hallway here. And the fourth and final workshop this morning is Preventing Disaster, an overview of efforts to force federal cuts to vital services and how to fight back. That is a federal policy and federal funding workshop that we're doing. Those are the workshops. Again, we will be continuing those workshops and concluding at 12 noon. We have a room where there will be food set up for a buffet lunch. You can grab your lunch, come into the room here, and we will begin a panel discussion with a number of our real legislative champions in the General Assembly of Pennsylvania. We're really looking forward to that panel discussion that'll be going on over lunchtime. Again, enjoy the workshops this morning. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and we want to wish you all the best. Thanks so much, everybody.